With our final speaker, Chris Rimmer. So I'm just going to quickly introduce Chris. Chris is the founder and director emeritus of the Vermont Center for Eco Studies, a nonprofit wildlife conservation group based in Norwich, Vermont. He completed his undergraduate studies in wildlife biology at the University of Vermont and graduate work in ecology and behavioral biology at the University of Minnesota, where he studied yellow warblers on the James Bay coast of Ontario. Prior to his graduate studies, Chris was an itinerant field biologist with stints in Peru, Ellesmere Islands, James Bay, coastal Massachusetts, Manomet Bird Observatory, and Antarctica. Much of his work over the past 3+ decades has focused on conservation research of Bicknell's thrush at both ends of its migratory range from New York and New England to the Dominican Republic and Cuba. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Ariane. Can everyone hear? Good. It's a privilege to be here in the shadow of Slide Mountain, which could be called the birthplace of Bicknell's thrush. More on that shortly. I don't think I've ever been to a meeting where I saw as many images of Bicknell's thrush as I had. Even the beer, which I had before dinner, delicious. I haven't tried the old-fashioned yet. Maybe I will. No, it's great to be here. I haven't been to an EBBA meeting for a long time. And I was really looking forward to seeing many of my gray-haired colleagues who I knew would be here. But I'm delighted to see so many people without gray hair here. The younger generation of ornithologists and future conservationists, and boy, do we need you. So it's really just inspiring to me to see so many of you and hear from you today. So Bicknell's thrush, I'm going to give you a whirlwind overview of a bird that has dominated the last 3+ decades of my life, consumed it, I might say, taken years away from my longevity, and but it's been a tremendous study subject for me and a lightning rod for science-based conservation across the hemisphere. So it's going to be hard to, keep up with the Purple Martin story we heard last night, and I don't have any videos, but I'll do my best. All right, I guess I get to advance myself. Oh, and just a quick word about the Vermont Center for Eco Studies, VCE, from which I am now officially retired, but I have a vested interest there. We're a wildlife conservation science group in central Vermont that studies different vulnerable wildlife populations. The mountain birds you'll hear about on the upper right. We manage and protect the common loon population in Vermont, which was formerly endangered, now recovered. We've done a lot of work on grassland birds, bobolinks, upland sandpipers, meadowlarks, but we also work on non-bird groups. We are doing now the second statewide butterfly atlas, second year of that coming up. We've done a bumblebee statewide atlas and a wild bee survey. We've done some really innovative work on vernal pool amphibians, and those are just a few of what VCE does. So if any of you are interested, check out the website. Lots of opportunities for community scientists like that person in the middle who are really the heart and soul of VCE and the work that we do. And I'll talk about one project that involves them and Bicknell's thrush. All right. So what's the big deal about this drab and distant bird? I love the poster out there about drab and distant birds that are often overlooked relative to their finely feathered and fancy friend or whatever it was. But how many of you have seen or heard of Bicknell's thrush in the flesh? Okay, fewer than half. It's not an easy bird to encounter, and there are many reasons why it's an important species to focus science-based conservation on. First of all, it is one of the rarest birds in eastern North America. I mean, there are a couple of others that beat it out, I'd say, but our estimate of its overall population is only about 100,000, maybe 125 if you count Canada. It's got a very restricted range at both ends of the migratory range and a fragmented distribution, as you can see, and we'll get into that a little bit. It's a habitat specialist at both ends of the range, here in the montane fir and spruce forests, down in the Caribbean where it winters on only 4 islands, in broadleaf, mostly cloud forest. And as you'll also see, there are a number of threats to its habitats at both ends of the range and probably in between. So we heard earlier that it is now classified by the IUCN as a globally vulnerable species. It is not endangered or threatened in any of the states in the US in which it nests. There are 5, I think, maybe 4. But it is federally threatened in Canada now. So it's a very high conservation concern, priority species for conservation, as it should be. So transport yourself away from this snowy winter landscape for a moment up to, I don't think this is actually taken in the Catskills, but it could be, to a mountaintop. And this is the summer home of the Bicknell thrush, the montane forests, conifer forests that are dominated by balsam fir and red spruce. This is where the only place you'll find them here in the Northeast. And I want to tell you the story of the discovery of Bicknell's thrush. On June 15th, 1881, Eugene P. Bicknell, rather dapper gentleman who lived on Long Island, was a very accomplished amateur botanist, but also an ornithologist, was on Slide Mountain and spied these 2 thrushes with which he was unfamiliar. He'd never seen them before. He knew his birds. So as ornithologists did back in those days, he didn't have a pair of Swarovskis or Leicas or Nikons, but he did have a shotgun. So he collected 2 specimens of this unfamiliar to him bird, and he sent them down to the Smithsonian, where at the time they were identified as a subspecies or race of the gray-cheeked thrush bird, which is much more broadly distributed through Canada and even into Alaska and Siberia. So this was the discovery of Bicknell's thrush on Slide Mountain in the Catskills, the type specimen. So I had the pleasure and privilege about 20 years ago of actually meeting 2 of Mr. Bicknell's maternal grandsons up on Mount Mansfield, Eugene Bicknell Doggett and his brother William, or Wick Doggett, came up, and I caught a bird and got this one picture of them. So for me, that's irrelevant to the story I'm about to tell, but it was a wonderful full circle connection with this bird that I have become quite enamored of, and at times disgusted by and frustrated by, but mostly enamored of, trust me. So the story of Bicknell's thrush languished in taxonomic obscurity for a long time. And then along came this gentleman, George Wallace, Vermont farm boy, actually, who grew up in the shadow of Mount Mansfield in Waterbury, Vermont, and had always been interested in birds. He, anyway, to make a longer story shorter, he decided to do his PhD research on Bicknell thrush on Mount Mansfield. So he went up there for 3 summers in a row, 3 consecutive summers in the mid-30s, with his wife. And they lived in one of the little huts up there, which are now on the Long Trail and service hikers. And he studied this bird assiduously. And he didn't have any of the modern technology that we're blessed with now, not even bird bands, but he found nests, and Martha, his wife, did a lot of the heavy lifting, apparently. And he did a really elegant basic life history study. He also examined all the specimens that he could get his hands on in different museums around the country. And his assessment was that Bicknell's thrush was indeed a subspecies. He didn't recommend changing the taxonomic classification. Some of you are probably wondering about this little fellow here on the table. That was an orphaned Bicknell's thrush that they found in a nest with its siblings had fledged and it hadn't. So they brought it in, and this bird lived with them for over a year. Little Bicky, they called it, him or her, we'll never know. And they actually took it down to Washington, D.C. to meet VIPs. Brought it back the next summer. And unfortunately, I do have to finish the story. One day they were boiling a pot of spaghetti water on the stove, and little Bicky decided to take a bath. And yeah. But anyway, George Wallace really was the person who put the bird on the map in many ways and set the stage for some of us to follow. So in the mid 90s, early 90s, a Canadian taxonomist, zoologist, ornithologist named Henri Ouellette, he became really curious about the taxonomy of Bicknell's thrush, and he also examined all the specimens he could get his hands on, and there were more at that point in the early 90s. He measured them very carefully, looked at the soft part coloration, the plumage. He compared vocalizations, calls, and songs. And then finally, he looked at the biochemistry, and he determined that Bicknell's thrush warranted full species status. So he proposed that to the American Ornithologists Union nomenclature committee, the God Squad of taxonomy, and they accepted it. And in 1995, Bicknell's thrush became officially a distinct species, which it now is. And some people argue that, actually. So then enters this guy from Vermont who went and heard Dr. Ouellette give a talk at an AOU meeting in Montreal about his belief that Bicknell's thrush warranted full species status. I didn't really care about the taxonomy that much. To me, it was interesting, but not crucially interesting. But I did recognize that we had this distinct taxon in our backyard, Vermont and New England and New York, about which we knew almost nothing. We really, the breeding bird survey doesn't cover it. There were no population trend information. And we knew that our mountains were under siege from a variety of forces that we'll talk about quickly. So I stuck my finger in the pond and then another finger, and here I am now 30 years later. All right. I'm hitting the same. Oh, there we go. So thank you. In thinking about Bicknell's thrush and these mountaintops, you really have to consider them as islands of habitat, sky islands. It's an archipelago across the landscape of our Northeast, which creates conditions that are different than, a black-throated blue warbler or wood thrush or any of the birds that are living in these much more contiguous, connected habitats. These literally are islands of habitat. What am I not doing here? I'm sorry, but
right. Click that. Oh, it's like tomato. No, done.
My colleagues used to call me techno poison for apparently a pretty good reason. There we go. Thank you. Could you just give the talk? Here is the distribution of montane spruce fir forests across the US. And you can see how fragmented and limited in distribution it is. It covers less than 1% of the landscape of our region. So these islands of habitat, which are distributed across the different mountain ranges. And down here in the Catskills, the forest is at a much higher elevation than it is up in the mountains of Maine, where it's much, much lower elevation. So this is this is the landscape that Bicknell thrush habitat occurs on. It's archipelago of islands. And here's one of them. Some of you will recognize this mountain, Whiteface, in the Adirondacks. And I like this slide because not only does it show one of the bigger mountains in the Adirondacks that is developed for skiing and has an auto road up it and a big building on top, but I like it because it shows these fir waves, these bands of dead and dying fir mostly and spruce, which are key components of this ecosystem. And these bands, which are suffer mortality from natural causes that are physically determined, regenerate to incredibly dense fir and spruce, and that's where you tend to find the maximum densities of Bicknell thrush. It's a very dynamic, constantly changing, harsh landscape. These fir forests, and I do call them fir forests. People say spruce fir, mostly balsam fir now. They're subject to a lot of mortality, natural mortality. You know, it's a very harsh place to live for any organism or to work in for a human, with heavy winds, ice loads in the winter, temperatures, black flies, you name it. So it's a tough place to live, tough place to eke out a living. And to work within it, this is an up close and personal view, it's not exactly inviting or easy either for a human. In fact, my hero, George Wallace, summed up my career pretty nicely, aptly, in this quote in his manuscript. So I accept the mantle of a freak ornithologist. It's okay. But you got to get to these mountains to study the bird. You got to be willing to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and work until 9 or 9:30 at night in the month of June, because they're very crepuscular. They're very active at dawn and dusk. There are some wonderful things about that. The sunrises and sunsets are magnificent. The sleep deprivation is cause for concern at times. But yeah, I sometimes tell myself that I should have picked a purple martin or a housefinch or something else, but you know, there's a lot to learn about this bird, and I have no regrets. All right. So these montane forest habitats are, as I said earlier, under siege from a variety of factors. One in the upper right is ski area development. So many of our mountains now are developed for skiing, fewer perhaps in the Catskills and Adirondacks than in Vermont and New Hampshire. And not so much now, but 10, 20 years ago, many of these mountains were in an expansion mode. They were building more trails, more lifts. They were connecting two mountains together. And every time you clear a ski area and make it bigger, you're taking away habitat inevitably. And now we're dealing with gladed ski. You know, we heard about informal trails today. Well, people are also putting in informal ski trails in the winter illegally and cutting these, you know, little narrow ribbons that they can go do their backcountry skiing in. So that's one. Many of our mountains are festooned with communications towers, telecommunications towers. Each one of those requires some clearing of land. It requires a road to get up to it. What would we do without our smartphones, right? But that's another assault on the habitat. Wind power, which hasn't really gained too much traction in the high elevations of the Northeast, but there are some. And same as the communications towers, you got to clear a patch of land, you got to build a road to service it. You know, these are just all cumulative whittling away of the habitat. Now, in Canada, I'm not going to talk much about Canada. Bicknell thrush in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick mainly, and also in Quebec, occupy a mostly an industrial forestry landscape, which is quite fascinating and raises all kinds of issues because they clear cut these forests. And sometimes you'll find the Bicknells in regenerating hardwoods, which will eventually go over to fir and spruce. So it's a very dynamic, ephemeral habitat for them up there, and they're still trying to figure out what's going on in these industrial forestry landscapes. But clearly, the most insidious threat to these high elevation forests is atmospheric pollution and climatic warming now. air above us is arguably a toxic soup of chemicals, which rain down upon these forests, which project high into the airspace and have all the conifer needles that are combing out the moisture from the clouds and all the pollutants within them. So atmospheric pollution is a biggie. And here's, Mount Mansfield, where I've done a lot of my work, Vermont's tallest peak in the clouds. And I don't think there's any question that the longest term threat to the survival of Bicknell thrush and other organisms that rely on this habitat is a warming climate. And we know that the distribution of balsam fir, which is the primary tree that Bicknell thrush use, is controlled by mean summer temperature. And it's known from work that's been done that if you raise the temperature 1 degree Celsius, you push the lower limit of where the fir can grow about 500 feet upslope. So with a 1 degree change, which we're approaching already, you're pushing it up, and with a 2 degree change, which is well within the limits of many emission scenarios, you're pushing the fir forests up onto only the highest peaks. So the prediction is, based on modeling work that we've helped do, as the temperature warms, the amount of area with fir forest is going to decrease, and the number of patches or mountaintops, peaks, is also going to decrease. So you're going to lose them on the small peaks. It's a sobering scenario. All right. That's a little bit of a backdrop. Now, how do we study this bird? Well, I don't need to tell you all about using mist nets and catching birds and putting color bands on, which turns out to be completely useless for the most part because you never see the darn things. But we did gain something from that. With the birds in our hand, we've done a lot of tissue sampling over the years and looked at all kinds of things from DNA to toxins to stable isotopes. When we've done a lot of tracking, we'll talk a little bit more about that. In the early days, we just did a radio telemetry following birds on a given mountain. And it was essential to find nests, as it turned out. And we learned a lot from that, which I'll get into. We've banded about a couple of thousand Bicknells now. And, you all know well what banding data can tell you about the demographic structure and recruitment and all kinds of things, but it also tells us about longevity. And these guys are survivors. We've had two 11-year-old birds now over the years, a couple of 10-year-olds, lots of 7, 8, 9-year-olds. These are both males. One was on Stratton Mountain and the other on Mount Mansfield. I mean, look at that band. You can tell that's been on there a while. And the orange band, practically not even orange anymore. So the banding has been a crucial tool in many different respects. I had a little fun and just thought, well, so each of these birds, if they migrate from Mount Mansfield or central Vermont down to the center of the Dominican Republic, that's about 1,900 miles. So if they do that over 11 years, each of those birds has gone over 40,000 miles. And that's just a straight line. Pretty remarkable. Now we know that adults have a pretty high survivorship. Both males and females, about 65% return from 1 year to the next. They're very site faithful on both ends of the range, in fact. But we don't know much about juveniles. We're pretty certain they're the ones that disperse, natal dispersal, spread the gene pool. We get very few returns of banded juveniles to Mount Mansfield. And I have to gloss over, in the interest of time, some of what we've learned. Now, you can't study an organism without understanding something about its reproduction if you really want to understand it and ultimately conserve it. So we spent an inordinate amount of time trying to find Bicknell thrush nests. Turns out to be ridiculously difficult, but if you use radio telemetry on females, that works. So we did end up finding about 100 nests over time. They're hard to find. You wouldn't think so once you find them. They're usually about this high in a very, very dense thicket. They're big, bulky nests, but it's just so hard to get around in that habitat. But one of the fascinating things that we learned, and it was completely unforeseen and opportunistic, was one of our biologists was on a ski trail on Stratton Mountain, and he was able to look in through an unnatural opening at a nest. He was able to watch it with his binoculars, which normally, if I'm as close as you, that's the closest I could ever see a nest with binoculars, and I'm too close and the birds won't go near it. But he was able to be, 20, 25 feet away and watch who was coming, and he noticed two color-banded males coming in and feeding the nestlings, one female. And this occurred over a couple of days, and it got us scratching our heads. That's kind of weird. What's going on? We better look at this more closely. So we did by putting up video cameras at near nests. So we could leave, they'd record for 4 hours, and we'd get a record of who was coming to feed the nestlings. And lo and behold, we found that about 75% of the 100 nests that we monitored on 2 different mountains had at least 2 males coming and feeding the chicks. One nest had 3, another had 4. All right, what is going on here? We asked ourselves. So the telemetry also revealed some interesting insights in that we could, follow individual birds around the study plot. And we found on many occasions that a bird that was singing on a song post 1 minute, 5 minutes later, there would be a different bird singing on that same song post, and possibly a third, 5 minutes after that. These birds were not, to make a long story shorter, I have to, were not territorial in the classical sense that songbirds are, at least in our minds. Males were ranging over a large, we call it a home range now. We did not call it a territory, not defending it. We just didn't know what was going on, but these males were not behaving like traditional territory holders. So turns out that Bicknell thrush have a very complex, I would say somewhat unique breeding system. You all know about polygyny, where male mates with multiple females, and polyandry, where a female has 2 or more male mates. Well, there's another one called polygynandry, and that's where both males and females mate with multiple partners. In a minute. But here are 3 Bicknell thrush male home ranges: red, blue, and black. Actually, there are 4, aren't there? And pink. These are female nests. So red encompasses 3 nests. Purple, pink has 2. Blue has 2. So, and black has 3. So the males were encompassing this large area that included several females. Now, when we did telemetry on females, which not only helped us find their nests, we discovered that they actually are territorial. They hold very discrete, non-overlapping territories. That was the only, they even defended them, as far as we could tell, from one another. And what it turns out, it's really hard to encapsulate. This story could be a whole talk in itself. We started looking at arthropod populations on different female territories, and we found big differences. Female quality varied a lot on territories, from one female to the next, judging by the number and diversity of arthropods, which is the main food for nestlings. And it turned out that females with crappy territories and few arthropods, they're the ones that had 2 or 3 or once 4 males. And the females with the really good territories and lots of bugs, they often didn't need any help at all. Really fascinating. And when we looked at paternity, so as you all know, being ornithologists and amateurs, females lay 1 egg a day. Bicknell thrush normally lay 4 eggs, so 1 a day for 4 days, and they start incubating. Each egg is fertilized independently, separately. So a female could mate with 7, 8, 10 males in 1 day. Only 1 male will be the lucky sire of that day's egg. And then the next day, it could be a different male. Well, when we looked at the paternity in the nest, it was all over the place. Every nest that and we sampled blood from the nestlings, had multiple sires. And males were feeding were feeding nests in which they might have had one or two of their own chicks, and then going over to another nest in which they had no paternity whatsoever, because they didn't know if a male mates with a female, right? If he's one of 7 or 8, and he probably doesn't know that he was one of 7 or 8, he might think that he's got a genetic investment in that nest, so he better take care of the kids. Just a really bizarre system. So the story takes a twist now, again, another twist. When we looked at the breeding adult sex ratios based on hundreds of birds that we banded, these are different sites, a couple in Canada, Mount Mansfield, different sites on Mansfield, and 2 on this southern Vermont mountain. And these are the number of years at which we looked at sex ratios. Look at the bias towards males. Overall, in all the populations that we've sampled, there are more than twice as many adult males as adult females in the breeding population. Okay, that ain't normal. So we had to ask ourselves, what's going on? Are they laying more male eggs? Nope. That ratio is 1-to-1 in the nestlings. Are male chicks fledging at a higher rate than females? Nope. When they leave the nest 10, 12 days later, 1-to-1. So something must be happening, has to be happening between the time that fledglings leave the nest and they come back a year later as breeding aged birds. We'll get back to that. So, another aspect of the natural history of this bird. Anybody pick out what's inside that red circle? Yes, I heard someone say red squirrel. Nose, eye, mouth, Bicknell thrush eggs. Big time predators on Bicknell thrush eggs and other open cup nesting species. And we learned some of this from our videotaping of nests. We also had one tape with a weasel coming to the nest and another with a sharp-shinned hawk scattering the young. But red squirrels are a big time predator. And what we've discovered is that their populations are very tied to the population of cones in a given year. And cones tend to be cyclical in their production, the fir cones mainly, but also spruce. So in years, and we documented going way back to the 30s across the whole region, a biennial pattern of cone production with a bad year followed by a good year, up and down. And in years with lots of cones, you get a lot more squirrels the following summer, spring and summer. And you get lousy productivity by Bicknell thrushes and white-throated sparrows and Swainson thrushes. And in years with low mass, low cones, fewer squirrels, much better. One of our concerns about climate change is that it might disrupt this whole cycle of masting and throw off the productivity. What actually seems to be happening so far is that massing is occurring less regularly and less often than it did, and we've actually had many fewer squirrels and higher recruitment the last few years. I'm not saying we're in good shape, but so superimposed on all these other things that we have to think about that are affecting Bicknell's thrush populations is this cycle. One of our other early questions was, we were working on ski areas. Mount Mansfield has a ski area on it, and Stratton Mountain has a ski area. So do ski areas affect these birds, their survival, their nesting success, anything else? So on each mountain, we established a study plot on the ski area and an adjacent plot on an undisturbed part of forest on the mountain. And we did everything that I've been talking about. And to make a long story short, because I have to again, what we found is actually Bicknell thrush are doing pretty well on existing ski areas. There's no dramatic difference in any of the factors we looked at, maybe a slight survival difference, lower on ski areas in males, but nothing significant. Ski areas love this finding, right? We haven't trumpeted it too loudly. I don't think that means if you take an undeveloped mountain and develop it for skiing that you're not exerting some major impacts. I would never say that, but these existing ski areas that have been around for 50 or more years, birds are doing okay. These edges of steep trails come up into very dense, they almost mimic fir waves. The birds love them. And you don't have blue jays or cowbirds up there. That was one question we had. So they're doing okay. Now, adding insult to injury. We heard about mercury earlier today. One thing we realized from some work that was done at the University of Vermont was that mercury deposition from the atmosphere was much, much higher at higher elevations than in surrounding low elevations. So when we superimpose, Bicknell thrush habitat on these areas of high mercury deposition, boy, that's kind of a striking correlation. So we thought, well, maybe we should check the Bicknell thrushes and see if they have mercury in their systems, in their blood and feathers. And we're not mercury experts, but we had these birds in our hand, right? And mercury is a serious toxic in our environment. We were pretty much laughed out of the room by mercury scientists who said, this is an aquatic problem. There's no way for the mercury to methylate up in these high elevation forests, so you're not going to find any mercury in them. We said, well, heck with it. We're going to look. And we did, and we sampled blood and took snips of feather. And lo and behold, every bird we sampled had mercury in its system. Now, not high levels, and we don't really know what a high level is in a Bicknell thrush, but they were not as high as in Carolina wrens, for example, in contaminated watersheds at least. But they all had it from Canada all the way here into the Catskills. Now, one of the interesting findings was that birds whose exact age we knew because they were banded as SYs, second years. So over time, their feathers, which, as you learned earlier, their feathers are inert, and the mercury in them does not change once it enters the feather and the feather molts. So looking at feather samples over time in known-age birds showed that it is accumulating in them. So that's a little bit of a concern. The other thing we looked at is we did a food web analysis, and we looked at mercury in the leaf litter, in the foliage, in the insects that eat the foliage, in spiders and other organisms that eat those insects, and then in Bicknell thrushes that eat the spiders and the lepidopteran larvae, and then in sharp-shinned hawks and saw-whet owls. And we found a very dramatic bioaccumulation of mercury in the system. So it's biomagnifying up the food chain, which is not surprising. And on one other interesting thing, I'll just tell you quickly. We also discovered that birds early in the season have much higher mercury levels than they do a month later. Their mercury is in the blood, which is the short-term dietary intake, was decreasing. And we think that's because, in part, mainly because they're eating a lot of spiders and other higher trophic level invertebrates early in the season before the lepidopteran larvae come out. And those have much higher mercury than the lepidopteran larvae. They're eating higher trophic level vertebrates. So that was a fascinating finding. Anyway, we don't think it's killing them. We do worry about sublethal effects. Obviously, we've got 10, 11-year-old birds. Mercury's not shortening their life dramatically, but it's just one more stressor on this stressed out bird. Oh, there we go. All right. So with that as background, what do we know about this bird? I told you there are no baseline population data. The breeding bird survey doesn't touch Bicknell thrush for the most part. We just didn't have any basis with which to evaluate their conservation status. But we did know that a site in northwestern Massachusetts, Mount Greylock, some of you have probably been up there, its population had become extirpated in the last century. There were a lot of birders in Massachusetts that went up there because it was the only place you could see Bicknell thrush, and they kept careful track, and there was a steady decline. We also knew that some sites in maritime Canada, mainly coastal sites, had lost their populations. So at the periphery of the range, we're seeing these extirpations, which is often an early warning signal that all is not well, that the range is beginning to contract from the periphery. So we, with Julie Hart's help, you know Julie Hart because you heard from her earlier today, began a program called Mountain Birdwatch. You heard about that earlier. It's a community science program to keep track of these high elevation birds. 10 montane species, 20-minute point counts, and there are about 125 sites from the Catskills all the way up into Maine. And this has been a great ongoing program. And it's not for the faint of heart because you got to get up there, start counting at 4 a.m., which usually means going up the night before. And it's really requires a heroic commitment on the part of our volunteers, and we're deeply thankful. But all right, this next slide is not very encouraging. Now, what we've learned in the first 10 years of the program, we can't really compare to the more recent 15 years, 14 years now. But over time, Bicknell thrush populations are not looking particularly robust. Overall, in the United States, there's been over a 4% annual decline in Bicknell thrush populations. And we can actually break that down by region. The Adirondacks are doing a little better overall, only 3% decline. Maine, almost 5%. New Hampshire, which is really the core, has more Bicknell thrush habitat than any other given mountain range, 5.5%. You're not going to like this one. Catskills, which are the southernmost extent of the range and probably the most subject to effects of climatic warming, are tanking. Vermont, don't ask me why, it's real, is basically at zero for some, but Vermont has the smallest number, maybe outside the Catskills, of Bicknell thrush. In Canada, maritime Canada, the birds are in a much steeper decline. They've disappeared from almost all of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick now. So this bird is not doing well. So obviously, at some point in its annual cycle, this species, Bicknell thrush, is being limited. Is it on the breeding grounds? Is it on the wintering grounds? Is it during migration? Is it some factor in each of those areas? We don't know. And I really need to improve this graphic of the range map. But unfortunately, migration ecology and patterns have been really a black box because, and I think you all know this, even as bird banders, you really cannot reliably separate Bicknells and gray cheek thrush during migration. In a mist net, maybe. If you get a really small winged bird, 87, 65 millimeter wing, or a really big one, 98, 100 millimeter wing, sure. But most of them are not safely separated. I can't tell you how many photos I get sent by birders who have a photo of a migrant bird and they want to know what it is. And every single time I tell them, sorry, can't do it. So we had to resort to tracking, as we've heard a lot about. We tried geolocators, light level geolocators. They did not do it. Huge error around the locations that we got. It just wasn't very useful. We are doing some nanotagging now, and I'm not really going to talk about that tonight. But what has been useful have been these archival GPS tags, which are not talking to satellites. They're archiving the data, so we got to recapture the birds. But we tagged birds in 2 years, 21 and 22, and got some good results, and I'm going to save those. But what we've learned over time, we already knew this because we've also had 2 band recoveries of our own birds. One was a bird we banded on Mount Mansfield in 1995, a male. We caught it 6 months later in the remote cloud forest of the Dominican Republic, came back to Mansfield the following summer, and I'm sure it was back in the cloud forest, but we couldn't catch it. Anyway, and we've had another nestling that showed up in another mountain range a year and a half later in the Dominican Republic. But we already knew that Hispaniola was the winter stronghold for this species. we think that 80 to 90% of the world population of Bicknell thrush is wintering on this one island. And that is a sobering state of affairs because there's been tremendous habitat loss on the island, as in so many other places in the neotropics. The DR is in much better shape than Haiti, and we think that great majority of Bicknell thrush are overwintering in the Dominican Republic. Here is a shot on the Haitian-Dominican border. These are trees that are probably 80 to 90 feet high, remnants of a majestic cloud forest that is now completely gone. Charcoal extraction for heating and cooking and export, agriculture, subsistence, cattle, logging, you name it. These incredible landscapes are just in really rough shape now. Thankfully, there are many areas like this one in the Dominican Republic that are intact. There's some wonderful habitat that still remains these birds, and this mountain, I'm sure there are a couple of hundred Bicknell thrush on that peak right there. And they're remote, they're difficult to get to. You can't really farm them. So that's been the saving grace, we think. The habitat in the wintering grounds is very, very different. It's not a conifer forest, but it's a very structurally dense, similar forest. It's cloud forest with incredibly impenetrable understory. You can't get through it without a machete. And what we've learned doing the same kinds of studies with banding and telemetry is that in the winter, Bicknell thrush actually are territorial, very territorial. All age and sex classes maintain these small defended territories from one another. They're quite small. They're only about an acre in size, and they're there for, think of it, 6-7 months of the year. We call them our birds, right? They're really their birds. They're spending most of their annual cycle somewhere else. So this was a really important finding, and thankfully, some birds are moving around. They're colonizing second growth habitat. There's some plasticity, which is maybe the saving grace for the bird. But this is a very significant finding. When we can't sex the birds in the winter the way we can in the summer, but we can take a little drop of blood and look at the mitochondrial DNA. So we were able to sex birds, and what we found is that in this mountain range down here, which is a high elevation, protected, pristine area of cloud forest, there are about 4 times as many males as there are female Bicknell thrushes. And this site up here in the northern coast, which is a lower elevation, much more disturbed, wetter area, lower arthropod populations, much more fruit, much higher arthropods and less fruit in the cloud forest. The sexes are about equal, 1 to 1, roughly. So, bottom line, we think that Bicknell thrushes are limited on the wintering grounds. The females are getting the squeeze because they're territorial. Males are claiming probably they're a little bit bigger, a little bit more aggressive, the optimal habitat, and forcing females into this lower quality, crappy habitat where they're either not surviving the winter or leaving in perhaps relatively poor condition or not making the full migration back here. We don't know exactly the mechanisms, but that's sort of what we're suspecting. Adding insult to injury, again, introduced rats. We've done telemetry and we lost 5 out of 46 radio tag birds over 3 winters to rat predation, black and Norway rats. They're on every habitat, even the most pristine, remote areas. And we decided, well, okay, we've got the birds in our hands on the wintering grounds. Their mercury in the blood will not be the same as it would be in the summer because they've had several months to turn it over. So we decided to sample them down there. And we found that birds on the wintering grounds, at least in the DR, well, actually all through the wintering grounds, have higher, 2 to 3 times higher mercury in their blood than they do up here. Where they're getting it, there are a few local sources, but we think most of it's global transport that we heard about earlier today. So wow, I mean, the deck is stacked against this little bird, isn't it? Here, I think, is the best shot of a Bicknell thrush ever on the wintering grounds in a tree fern. Um, so what are we going to do? Well, first of all, we had to find out a little bit more about where else they might be in on the wintering grounds. So we went over to Haiti. We knew that Haiti was a mess, but we trudged up through some desolate landscapes into some high elevation forest and found Bicknell thrushes in patches of really nice intact forest. This is one of the areas of most intact forest. This was about 20 years ago. I bet it doesn't look like that now. I'm sorry to say. I hope it does, but I bet it doesn't. Now, I like this next picture. Anybody recognize that fetching young biologist on the right? That is Julie Hart on top of the tallest mountain in Haiti, hugging a massive endemic Hispaniolan pine.
Get destroyed, like.
Yeah, there was a big hurricane that went through there 3 or 4 years ago that took a lot of those trees down, unfortunately. I just had to throw that in there. But here is, an all too typical scene in the Haitian countryside of a farmer actually farming this dogtooth limestone, this horrendous stuff. You do not want to walk through that, and growing little crops in the nooks and crannies. I mean, it's the epitome of eking out an existence. And these people have no choice. I mean, they have to survive, and they have to cut down the forest to farm. So it's a big issue. We did some modeling that suggested that, based on our survey data, that we should also look in Cuba and Puerto Rico and Jamaica. Those are the 4 islands where the entire global population of Bicknells exists. We looked in Puerto Rico for 2 winters, surveyed hard, we found 11 birds. That ain't the place. Jamaica, we found 8. Cuba, I went there for 4 years in a row, down to the southeastern corner of the country where there's a very big mountain range called the Sierra Maestra. And we replicated some surveys that had been done by our Canadian colleagues 15 years earlier. And we did find good numbers of birds there, I'm pleased to say. And this peak here is the highest peak in Cuba. It's almost 2,000 meters high, Pico Turquino. And this entire mountain range is pristine. There's no loss of habitat. There's nobody going in there and cutting trees. There's no reason to. Cuba's socialist, and there's no economic incentive for anyone to go in and try to take the forest away. So it's very pristine, and I wish there were a lot more birds in Cuba than we found. We didn't really find many. It's certainly got the second largest population of any of the islands other than Hispaniola, but our findings there really confirmed that we got to focus on Hispaniola if we're going to keep this bird around. And so we are. Now I just want to talk briefly about these archival GPS tags that really gave us some terrific new insights. And don't get too hung up on this slide, but we tagged birds at 2 sites, one in Canada, southern Quebec, and one on Mount Mansfield. And over 2 years, found that most of them are stopping over in the mid-Atlantic. Here's a expanded view, as we suspected, and then striking out over the open ocean from usually the Carolinas and ending up, most of them, right here, right in the DR. 1 bird in Haiti, 2 birds in Haiti, 1 bird on Cuba, most of them in the central mountain range of the DR. So that's been a very promising technique. We're now using nanotags, and there will be more to come on that. So two birds, I just have to champion these 2 females. We got 2 consecutive years of tracking from them. One was the only bird who went to Cuba. She overwintered in the exact same territory both years in a row. The timing was almost the same. You can see she went right through, followed the same track. Remarkable. And then this bird that went to the exact same spot in the DR. This is the highest bird at the highest elevation ever recorded on the planet. at about 26 or 700 meters elevation in the central GR, a female. And she went to the exact same spot. She's one of the few birds that gave us a spring track because their batteries inevitably died right before they left in May. But and as we've long suspected, they do a more inland route up to Florida. So that we've learned a lot from that, and we're writing that up now, actually. All right, so what are we doing about this situation, which is somewhat dire? One of our real, I think, fundamental techniques is to mentor and train our local partners. These are the people whose countries we are working in and who have a vested interest in protecting the biodiversity and the natural habitats. So we spend a lot of time training our younger partners, and I think that's had a really positive effect. I've enjoyed it. It's been really rewarding for me. And I'd like to think that we've equipped a new generation of conservationists. I know we have. Whether they can turn the tide is a whole nother story. We've also done a lot of outreach. We created the first field guide to the birds of the island in 3 languages, English, French, and Spanish. Because conservation is about people. You all know this. And to achieve anything, you've got to do some good outreach. We instituted the first eBird portal for Hispaniola, which is now part of just eBird Caribbean. And we've created a 2nd edition field guide. So we've just got to get to people. We brought some of our colleagues up here and done exchange programs, taken them to the Cornell Lab, down to the Museum of Comparative Zoology, down to Manomet. Here we are in Mount Washington. We had a great couple days up there with the Bicknells and the American pipits who were in the Alpine Garden there. And I think this is maybe the most important thing that I've ever done in my career, arguably, is really working with these incredibly dedicated. They're like sponges. They just so desperately want to learn as much as they can and turn things around. I just want to say as well that we're making this all about Bicknell's thrush, but on the wintering grounds on Hispaniola, there are 31 endemic birds that occur nowhere else on the planet, and these are some of the most endangered birds in the Caribbean, and are often occupying the same cloud forest habitats as Bicknell's. And these are what our local counterparts are really focused on as well. These are truly their birds, and we've done some really nice work on them too. We found the first nest described to science for a couple of species, including this one, the western chat tanager. So I think we've made a difference even beyond Bicknell's thrush. But ultimately, it comes down to habitat, right? To restoring lost habitat, to curtailing continued loss of habitat. This is a scene that's all too common in Haiti that we just need to turn around. And there are ways to do it. We've done some payment for ecosystem services work. We're now actually actively working with local communities to restore habitat, grow native plants. It's complicated and challenging. We have an international working group. We've done a conservation action plan. We're revising it right now. That's a sort of a guide map for how are we going to conserve this bird and its habitats across the entire range. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm kind of going quickly. But when it comes right down to it, this little 1-ounce bird that we banded on Mansfield, caught in Hispaniola, is really a connection between our 2 parts of the world. And it's a very compelling biological link that we have to pay attention to it across every part of its annual journey. And if we ignore one part, we're placing everything at great peril. So it's a full life cycle approach, which is the only way to achieve conservation of a migratory animal, really. So I'm ending up here, kind of giving you a superficial overview. And people ask me, well, what's your outlook for Bicknell's thrush? Depends when you ask me. It's hard to be resoundingly optimistic, honestly, given the factors that I've described and that you all know about anyway. I think if we work hard and get the right people in office and change some policies, there's a chance that we're going to be hearing a good chance hearing Bicknell's Thrush singing on Slide Mountain and Plateau and Hunter and Whiteface and Mansfield for decades to come, maybe centuries. So I'm going to end it there, and thanks, and I'll answer any questions you might have.